Betty's life had never been easy, but the day she lost her parents and two younger siblings in a fatal accident, her entire world collapsed. At just 20 years old, she was left alone in the unforgiving streets of Lagos, with no family to turn to and no money to sustain herself. She had once been a promising university student with big dreams, but reality had dealt her a cruel hand. Forced to drop out of school, she wandered the streets, searching for work, any work, to survive. For weeks, she knocked on doors, applied for jobs, and pleaded for help, but Lagos was a city that never slowed down for anyone. People were too busy chasing their own dreams to notice a struggling orphan. Hunger clawed at her stomach, and the thought of homelessness haunted her every night. When she heard of a job opening as a maid in the mansion of Chief Sammy Okafor, a billionaire known for his lavish lifestyle and questionable morals, she saw it as a lifeline. Swallowing her pride, she applied, praying that this would be her chance to rebuild her life. When she stepped into the grand Okafor mansion for her interview, she felt overwhelmed. The marble floors gleamed under the bright chandeliers, and the scent of expensive cologne filled the air. She had never been in a place like this before. The house manager, an elderly woman named Mama Esther, eyed her carefully before hiring her on the spot. "Do your job well, and you will have a roof over your head," she said. Betty nodded, determined to prove herself. This was her only chance, and she wouldn't waste it. The first few days in the Okafor mansion were like stepping into another universe. Betty had never seen so much wealth in one place. Expensive paintings lined the walls, gold-trimmed furniture filled every room, and the staff wore crisp uniforms that signified their ranks. It was clear that Chief Sammy Okafor spared no expense in maintaining his luxurious lifestyle. Betty quickly learned the hierarchy within the house. The senior maids held authority over the newer staff, and the butlers managed the daily schedules. Betty, being the newest and youngest, was assigned the most tedious tasks: scrubbing floors, washing dishes, and handling the laundry. Though it was exhausting, she embraced the work, knowing that at least she had food to eat and a bed to sleep in. Despite her best efforts to remain unnoticed, Betty soon caught glimpses of the man who owned it all. Chief Sammy was everything the rumors said he was: tall, confident, and effortlessly charming. He had a powerful presence that made people either fear him or desire him. Women came and went from the mansion, each one more beautiful than the last. Betty saw how they clung to him, laughing at his jokes, eager to please. It was clear that love had no place in this house, only pleasure. Betty told herself she was different. She was just a maid, invisible in the grand scheme of things. But as days turned into weeks, she found herself watching him more closely, noticing the small things, the way he ran his fingers through his hair when he was deep in thought, the way he smirked when he was amused. She scolded herself for such foolish thoughts. A man like Sammy Okafor would never notice a girl like her. But she had no idea that fate had other plans. Betty's routine remained the same for weeks: wake up early, clean the house, avoid trouble, and go to bed exhausted. But working in the mansion meant she saw more than she should. She watched as a new woman arrived almost every night, each one draped in designer dresses and smelling of expensive perfume. Some stayed for hours, others for days, but none of them lasted. Sammy had a reputation, and he lived up to it. He was a man who took what he wanted and discarded it when he was done. Betty didn't understand how a man could have everything yet still be so restless. Was he searching for something? Or was he simply addicted to the chase? One night, Betty overheard a heated argument between Sammy and one of his lovers. The woman was furious, accusing him of never taking anything seriously. "You use people and throw them away, Sammy. One day you'll regret it," she shouted before storming out. Betty expected Sammy to be angry, but instead he laughed, pouring himself a drink. To him, love was just a game. Betty swallowed the bitter truth. She was working for a man who had everything yet valued nothing. But why did that bother her? Why did her heart tighten every time she saw him with another woman? She shook off the thoughts, reminding herself that she was just a maid, nothing more. Despite the wealth surrounding her, Betty remained painfully aware of her reality. She was still poor, still trapped in a life she never wanted. Every month, she sent a portion of her wages to an elderly neighbor who had cared for her after her parents' death. It wasn't much, but it was all she could do. She often lay awake at night staring at the ceiling, thinking of what could have been. If her parents hadn't died, she would have graduated from university by now. She would have had a good job, a future. But fate had stolen everything from her, leaving her with nothing but broken dreams. The thought made her desperate to escape, to find a way out of the cycle of poverty. She knew the harsh truth: as long as she remained a maid, she would always be beneath people like Sammy Okafor. She had to do something, anything. But what? As she lay in bed one night, staring at the ceiling, a dangerous idea crept into her mind that would change her life forever. As the days passed, Betty couldn't shake the thought that had taken root in her mind. The desire to change her life, to escape the clutches of poverty, gnawed at her. She knew she needed something more than just hard work. She had seen how Chief Sammy Okafor's lovers flaunted their designer bags, their luxury cars, their carefree lives. It wasn't fair. Why should she struggle when others lived in excess? One evening, after completing her chores, she lingered outside Sammy's bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and she could hear the sound of laughter from within. Another woman. Betty sighed, pushing away the irrational jealousy rising in her chest. She wasn't supposed to care. She was just a maid, but the temptation grew stronger each day. That night, after cleaning his room, she found herself staring at the trash bin. There, amidst the discarded tissues and wrappers, was the used condom. Her heart pounded wildly. Could she really go through with it? A shiver ran down her spine as she reached for it, hesitating only for a moment before making the choice that would change her life forever. The moment it was done, Betty felt an overwhelming sense of dread. What had she done? Her body trembled as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling both terrified and hopeful. If she was pregnant, would Sammy take responsibility? Or would he throw her out onto the streets, leaving her worse off than before? Days turned into weeks, and Betty found herself anxiously watching for signs. She had been around enough women to recognize the symptoms: morning sickness, fatigue, the subtle changes in her body. The realization hit her like a storm. She was pregnant. She kept the secret to herself, afraid of what would happen if anyone found out. But as her stomach grew, whispers began to circulate among the staff. Mama Esther watched her closely, her sharp eyes missing nothing. One evening, she pulled Betty aside, her voice low and firm. "You're with child, aren't you?" Betty's throat tightened. She could only nod. Mama Esther sighed, rubbing her temples. "Does the chief know?" "No," Betty whispered, fear creeping into her voice. "You can't hide it forever, child." Mama Esther's gaze softened. "Prepare yourself. This will not end the way you think." The truth came out sooner than Betty had hoped. One morning, as she served breakfast, Sammy noticed something different about her. His sharp eyes narrowed, scanning her carefully. "You're looking different," he remarked, setting his coffee cup down. Betty froze, her hands trembling. Before she could respond, another staff member blurted out the news. "She's pregnant, sir." Silence fell over the dining hall. Sammy's expression darkened as he turned to Betty, disbelief flashing in his eyes. "Is this true?" Betty swallowed hard. There was no point in lying now. "Yes." The room erupted in whispers, but Sammy had eyes only for Betty. His fists clenched, his jaw tightening. "How?" Betty lowered her gaze, shame washing over her. She had expected anger, but nothing could have prepared her for the storm that followed. Sammy stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You think you can trap me?" he growled. "You think you can manipulate me into taking care of you?" Tears pricked Betty's eyes, but she refused to break. She had made her choice, and now she had to face the consequences. For days, Sammy avoided her. He was furious, but there was something else beneath his anger. Confusion, frustration, and maybe even a flicker of something more. One evening, he called her into his office, his demeanor unreadable. "I should throw you out," he began, his voice cold. "You betrayed me, Betty." She remained silent, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "But I won't." Her breath hitched as he leaned forward, his intense gaze locking onto hers. "You want security? You want a better life? Fine. But it won't be handed to you. We will get married." Betty's heart pounded. Marriage? To a man who despised her? "You will be my wife, not out of love, but out of necessity," Sammy continued. "You will raise this child, but under my terms." Betty's mind spun. This wasn't the fairy tale she had dreamed of, but it was a chance, her only chance. And so she nodded, sealing her fate. The news of their marriage spread like wildfire. High society was in an uproar. How could the billionaire playboy settle down with a mere maid? Sammy's mistresses were furious, and his business partners were baffled. But the wedding went on, a quiet yet extravagant ceremony attended only by close associates and family. Dressed in an elegant white gown, Betty couldn't help but feel out of place. She had dreamed of this moment once, but not like this. Sammy stood beside her, his expression unreadable, his hand firm around hers as they exchanged vows. As the ceremony concluded, Sammy leaned in, whispering, "You got what you wanted, but don't expect love from me." Betty forced a smile, her heart sinking. She had won the battle, but the war was far from over. Married life was nothing like Betty had expected. Sammy was distant, treating her like a business arrangement rather than a wife. They shared a house, but not a home. Yet, despite his cold demeanor, he never mistreated her. He provided for her, ensuring she had everything she needed, even enrolling her back in school. At first, Betty focused solely on her studies, determined to build a future for herself and her unborn child. But over time, she began to see another side of Sammy. The way he worked late into the night, the exhaustion in his eyes, the rare moments of vulnerability he never let anyone see. She realized that behind his arrogance was a man who had built walls so high that even he was trapped inside them. One evening, as they sat in silence during dinner, Betty found herself asking, "Are you happy?" Sammy looked at her, genuinely surprised by the question. He scoffed. "Happiness is a luxury, Betty. Not everyone is lucky enough to have it." She frowned, sensing the depth behind his words. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to Sammy Okafor than she had thought. Betty had resigned herself to a loveless marriage, but as days turned into weeks, something between her and Sammy began to shift. Though he remained distant, she noticed the small ways he showed concern, ensuring she took her vitamins, arranging for a private doctor to check on her, and even making sure the kitchen staff prepared the meals she craved. It wasn't affection, but it was something. One evening, Betty sat in the study, attempting to read one of her school textbooks when Sammy walked in. He paused, staring at her as if seeing her for the first time. "You're really serious about this school thing, aren't you?" he asked, his tone lacking its usual arrogance. She looked up, meeting his gaze. "Yes, education was always my dream before everything. I won't let it slip away again." Sammy nodded thoughtfully and walked away without another word. But that night, Betty found a brand new laptop on her desk, a small note attached. "For your studies." For the first time, she wondered, was there a heart buried beneath all of Sammy Okafor's wealth and pride? Weeks passed and the distance between them lessened. One evening, as they sat together at the dinner table, a rare occurrence in itself, Sammy surprised Betty by asking about her coursework. She hesitated before answering, unsure if he was truly interested or just making conversation. "It's tough, but I love learning," she admitted. "I just want to be independent, to be able to take care of myself and my child." Sammy studied her for a moment before sighing. "Independence is important, but sometimes it's okay to rely on someone too." Betty tilted her head, intrigued. "Like you?" he chuckled, though there was no humor in his voice. "I haven't relied on anyone in years. Not since I learned that love and trust are just illusions." She frowned. "What happened to you?" Sammy exhaled deeply, staring into his glass of wine. Let's just say I learned the hard way that people only stick around when it benefits them. Betty realized then that Sammy's playboy ways weren't just out of arrogance, they were a shield, armor against the pain of betrayal. Despite his claim of being emotionally detached, Sammy continued to surprise her. He started coming home earlier, spending time with her in the evenings. He even joined her in her prenatal classes once, though he pretended it was just to avoid bad press. The instructor had smiled at them, assuming they were a happy couple. Betty had almost laughed at the irony. One afternoon, Betty was reading when Sammy walked in, holding a small velvet box. Her breath hitched as he placed it in front of her. "Open it," he said gruffly. She hesitated before lifting the lid. Inside was a delicate gold bracelet, simple yet elegant. "Why?" she asked, confused. He shrugged. "You're my wife. Doesn't matter how we got here. You deserve something nice." A warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't an extravagant gift, but it was thoughtful. For the first time, she saw a glimpse of the man Sammy could be, if only he allowed himself to feel. Just as Betty started to believe their relationship might have a chance, the past came knocking. One of Sammy's former lovers, a famous socialite named Vanessa, made a scene at a charity event they attended together. She stormed up to them, her eyes blazing with fury. "You married her," Vanessa sneered. "A maid? A nobody? After everything we had?" Betty clenched her fists, but held her ground. Sammy, however, remained unfazed. "Vanessa, leave. You and I were never meant to be anything more than a fleeting moment." Vanessa laughed bitterly. "You'll regret this. She can never be one of us, Sammy. You'll get bored, just like you always do." Sammy grabbed Betty's hand and led her away, ignoring the murmurs around them. But Betty couldn't ignore the doubt Vanessa's words had planted in her heart. That night, Betty sat on the bed, staring at the bracelet on her wrist, her fingers absently tracing the delicate gold band. Doubt swirled in her mind like an unrelenting storm. Vanessa's words had ignited a fear she had tried so hard to suppress. What if she really was just a temporary phase in Sammy's life? A convenience? Would he wake up one day and realize she could never truly fit into his world? Sammy entered the room, rolling his sleeves up as he walked toward the dresser. His reflection in the mirror caught hers. "You're quiet tonight," he observed. She hesitated before speaking. "Is Vanessa right?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. Sammy turned to her fully, his brows furrowing. "About what?" "That you'll get bored of me, that I don't belong in your world." A muscle in his jaw ticked as he walked over, crouching before her. He took her hand, his grip firm yet warm. "Betty, if I wanted to leave, I would have. But I'm here. And you? You're stronger than any of them. You don't need their approval." She searched his face, looking for deception, but found none. His words carried weight, but she still feared the unknown. Sammy, as much as he had changed, was still a man used to fleeting attachments. Could he really commit? As if sensing her turmoil, he leaned closer. "I know I have a past. I won't pretend I was a good man before you came along, but you make me want to be different, to be better." Betty's breath caught in her throat. Was this the truth, or just another carefully crafted lie? Only time would tell. As Betty's pregnancy progressed, so did her bond with Sammy. They still had their differences, but their conversations became easier, their silences more comfortable. Sammy attended every doctor's appointment without being asked. He was there when she felt the first kick, his expression softening in a way that made her chest ache. One evening, as they sat on the balcony watching the city lights, Sammy spoke quietly. "I never thought I'd be a father. I always assumed I'd die alone, just another rich man with no one who truly cared." Betty turned to him, her heart pounding. "You don't have to be alone, Sammy." He looked at her then, and for the first time, she saw something different in his eyes, something real. The atmosphere in their home had changed. Sammy had softened in ways Betty never imagined possible. He no longer spent nights out with other women or kept his distance. Instead, he was present,
asking questions about her studies, making sure she was comfortable, and ensuring that the house staff respected her as his wife, not just a former maid who had stumbled into wealth. But while his actions showed care, he still struggled with words. There were no declarations of love, no romantic gestures beyond his usual practicality. One night, Betty was in the study, reviewing her coursework, when Sammy walked in. He leaned against the bookshelf, watching her with an intensity that made her pause. "You're really dedicated to this," he said, nodding towards her open laptop. Betty smiled faintly. "It's my second chance. I don't want to waste it." Sammy hesitated before stepping closer. "You won't. I'll make sure of it." It was a simple statement, yet it carried a weight she didn't fully understand. Did he mean it as a promise, or was it simply another way for him to exert control? Betty wasn't sure. But for now, she let herself believe in the warmth in his voice. As her due date neared, Betty found herself battling emotions she had no control over. Doubts, fears, and excitement warred within her. Would Sammy truly stay? Or was he only fulfilling an obligation? She needed to know. One evening after dinner, she finally voiced her concerns. "Sammy, what happens after the baby comes?" He frowned, setting down his wine glass. "What do you mean?" Betty sighed. "Will we still be whatever this is? Or will you go back to your old ways?" Sammy studied her, his gaze unreadable. Then, to her surprise, he reached for her hand. "Betty, I'm not going anywhere. This is my family now." For the first time, she saw genuine sincerity in his eyes. It wasn't just about duty anymore. He had changed, or at least, he was trying to. The night Betty went into labor was chaotic. She had been resting when the sharp pains woke her, sending her into a panic. Sammy was by her side instantly, barking orders to the staff, demanding the driver get the car ready. His usual arrogance was replaced with sheer panic as he paced the hospital corridor while she was wheeled into the delivery room. Hours later, the cries of a newborn filled the air. A nurse walked out, smiling at Sammy. "Congratulations, Chief Okafor. It's a baby boy." Sammy exhaled, the weight of everything hitting him at once. When he was finally allowed to see Betty, he walked in cautiously. She was exhausted but cradling their son with a tenderness that made his heart ache. "Meet our son," she whispered, looking up at him. Sammy sat beside her, staring at the tiny life they had created. In that moment, he knew. Everything had changed. Fatherhood didn't come naturally to Sammy, but he was determined to figure it out. He watched as Betty instinctively knew what their baby needed, how she rocked him when he cried, how she hummed lullabies softly in the middle of the night. Sammy had never seen anything so pure, so beautiful. The first few weeks were a test of patience and endurance. The sleepless nights, the endless crying, the moments of helplessness. Sammy had never imagined how much work came with raising a child. There were times he felt out of place, unsure if he was doing enough. Yet, every time he hesitated, Betty was there, calm and steady. She didn't demand anything from him, didn't push, didn't force him into a role he wasn't ready for. Instead, she let him find his way, and in doing so, he realized he didn't just want to be a provider. He wanted to be a father. One evening, as he held his son for the first time without fear, he whispered, "I'll be better for you, for both of you." And for the first time in his life, he meant it. Love had never been a word Sammy associated with himself. He had believed it was an illusion, a weakness. But as he watched Betty care for their son, as he felt the weight of his child in his arms, something inside him cracked open. The love he had dismissed for years had finally found him in the most unexpected way. Betty saw the change too. He was still the same Sammy, proud, stubborn, sometimes insufferable. But he was also softer now. He kissed their son's forehead without hesitation. He checked on Betty throughout the night. He made sure she had everything she needed. It was subtle at first, but Betty noticed how much more present he was, how he had started to cherish the little moments, the laughter of his son, the warmth of Betty's presence, the comfort of their growing family. One evening, as they sat together in the nursery, watching their child sleep, he turned to her and simply said, "I love you." Betty's breath caught. She had never expected to hear those words from him. But as she looked into his eyes, she knew he wasn't just saying them. He meant them. And that was enough. Just when things seemed to settle, ghosts from the past reappeared. Sammy's former lovers, old business rivals, even distant family members, all had something to say about his sudden change. Rumors swirled in high society, questioning whether Betty had truly earned her place beside him. Betty, however, refused to let their words shake her. She had fought too hard to get here, to build something real with Sammy. And when one of Sammy's exes, Vanessa, showed up at their doorstep, trying to reclaim what she thought was hers, Sammy didn't waver. "I have a family now," he said firmly, "and nothing will change that." It was the first time Betty had ever felt truly secure in what they had. Vanessa, defeated, scoffed. "We'll see how long that lasts," she sneered before storming away. But Betty wasn't afraid. She had seen the real Sammy, not the one the world believed him to be, and she knew deep down that he had made his choice. With Sammy's support, Betty finished her studies and even started a business of her own. She was no longer just the girl who had taken a desperate gamble. She was a woman with ambition, a mother with dreams. She built something of her own, something that wasn't tied to Sammy's wealth, and that independence made her stronger than ever. At first there were doubts. Would people respect her business, or would they assume it was just another gift from her billionaire husband? Betty worked tirelessly to prove that she was capable. She attended business meetings, made strategic decisions, and within a few years, her company flourished. Sammy, once a man who believed only in power and money, was her biggest supporter. He took pride in watching her succeed, knowing that her success was her own. They built their life together, one step at a time, proving everyone wrong. Marriage, like anything, wasn't without its struggles. There were arguments, moments of doubt, and challenges they had to overcome. Sammy, who had spent years avoiding emotional intimacy, had to learn how to be a husband, not just a protector, but a true partner. There were days when they fought, days when they doubted, days when the past threatened to tear them apart. But unlike before, they faced those challenges together. Betty didn't run, and Sammy didn't shut down. Instead, they communicated, they compromised, and they grew stronger. One night, after a particularly heated argument about Sammy's controlling tendencies, Betty sat beside him on their balcony, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "You have to trust me," she whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." Sammy exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I know," he admitted. "I'm just terrified of losing you." Betty reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "Then stop pushing me away." That night, for the first time, Sammy let himself be vulnerable, and in doing so, he finally understood that love wasn't just about protection, it was about trust. Years later, as they watched their son take his first steps, Sammy pulled Betty close. "I used to think I had everything," he murmured. "Money, power, women, but I had nothing until I had you." Betty smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "And now?" "Now, I have everything I never knew I needed." Life wasn't perfect. There would always be new challenges, new hurdles, new lessons to learn. But through it all, they had each other. Betty had once been a desperate maid, clinging to a reckless hope. But now, she was a woman who had found love, built a family, and created a life beyond her wildest dreams. From desperation to destiny, she had truly found her way home. The end.